Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my BookTube Prize 2022 Quarterfinals Ranking video. I am so excited, maybe a little nervous as well. To recap what the BookTube Prize is, it was started by Robert at Barter Hordes in 2019. It is for booktubers and other social media readers and enthusiasts. We come together to judge the best in literary fiction, nonfiction, and translated fiction that was published in the US the year prior. We have 4 rounds where we whittle really long lists down into winners and runners-up in October. So the quarterfinals is the end of round 2, where I judged nonfiction Group A. This might not be of any interest really to anyone but myself, but another geeky thing I'm doing is I have the long lists and the contenders for the long list that didn't make the long list that Robert sent us in January. This is for literary fiction and nonfiction because these are the 2 divisions I signed up to judge. And I've just been tracking how all the books are doing, basically. So, for nonfiction, 18 of the 20 books I voted for made it onto the long list, and 6 of them remain in contention for the semifinals. And then in fiction, 17 of the 20 books I nominated made it to the long list, and 5 of them remain in for the semifinals. And also, the 3 books that I voted for in the octafinals are still in the running for the semifinals, so that's also pretty fun. I guess I'm a little anxious about this, even though the 3 books that I voted for in the quarterfinals are the 3 that advanced to the semifinals. But I understand that the judging for nonfiction was razor thin, so I will be fascinated to hear what other judges have to say, because I would assume their opinions of these books are very different from mine. So I hope you post your videos or leave comments on this one, whatever works for you. I just am so curious, and I guess I feel a little anxious because I know, for example, I know for certain that there's some booktubers I really respect and admire their opinions, and I know that my opinions in these 6 books diverge from theirs, but what can you do? I guess that's really the fun of, reading in general. We all come to things with our own perspectives, and the conversation enlivens and enriches everything, so I hope. So here's my contribution, which I should get to, because I have a long script ahead of me. So, in the 6th and last place, I put Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis by Serhii Plokhy. This book documents the incredibly tense months and weeks leading up to and encompassing the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a time when the doomsday clock was ticking down, and worldwide nuclear destruction might be imminent. Using political sources, including recently unearthed KGB documents, Plokhy takes us to the councils convened by the power players. President John F. Kennedy in the US, Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the USSR, and President Fidel Castro in Cuba. It is a very dry, policy-driven book, and I found it difficult to get into. I admit to some personal bias there. But I also think that Plokhy failed or distorted things with his framing device. He was really amping up the fact that his book was important because of what was going on today. And yes, nuclear catastrophe is a serious problem today, particularly given the actions of characters like Trump and Putin. But I don't think the meat of his book supported that particular focus. The narrative was too granular. It's worth learning about what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in this book, for its own merits. And maybe I should go ahead and check out a memoir or something with more emotional heart. In number 5, I put The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song by Henry Louis Gates Jr. One of the fun things about the BookTube Prize, apparently, is that I get to read repeat authors. 2 years ago, I reviewed Gates's previous book, The Stony Road, for the 2020 BookTube Prize quarterfinals. It's interesting to ruminate on what's different and what's the same about this book, which chronicles the history of the Black Church in the United States. I think both books were too short and too fleeting with complex topics. This one was an improvement in that it was more focused. And yet, as the companion piece to Gates's PBS documentary, it also felt a little incomplete on its own. Still, there's a lot to recommend this book. Gates touches on so much from slavery to modern times, and Black spirituality that moves far beyond conventional Christianity. It is truly a song with movements. He also doesn't stray from controversy, providing interviews with leaders and thinkers who criticize the church and try to change the church based on some past examples of sexism and homophobia. And then there's the activists from the civil rights movement from the 1960s to the Black Lives Matter movement of today, which both stemmed from the church and moved beyond it. This is a great primer on how religion, culture, history, and policy work together in human consciousness, and it's a must-read education for Americans. In fourth place, I put A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds by Scott Wiedensaul. If there's any bias I have with this book, it's that maybe I treated it too kindly. Because after my quarterfinals ballot last year, where I put the two nature books at the bottom of the list, I was like, egads, am I being fair here? Obviously, the word science makes me think of the phrase alien language. But these are well-received books in the nonfiction world. And I do have a brain. A brain that, in this case, was excited to join the cool kids of BookTube and finally read about birds. And overall, I thought this was great. Overwhelming, of course, for someone like me who isn't even a casual birder. But Wiedensaul made their world, the world of migratory birds, at least so far as naturalists understand it, come alive to me. It seems like that knowledge is only growing, now that technology can track these creatures like never before. It's leading Wiedensaul and his colleagues to understand all sorts of new things about the lives and needs of these birds, and maybe even some applications that can be useful in studying humans ourselves. That's the positive, of course. The negative is how completely human activity and climate change are putting most of these birds on the endangered species lists. Wiedensaul wrote with a strange mix of fatalism and optimism. I'm not sure there was much narrative flow between chapters, and some of his writing about personal stuff rubbed me the wrong way. Particularly how none of the women he mentioned had near as much backstory as any of the men. Also, I'm not sure how much of this will stick with me, but that's probably more on me. The more you read on a subject, the more you know. And I'm peaked. But now on to the 3 books I chose to advance to the next round of the BookTube Prize. Starting with my number 3 spot, which was Crying in H Mart, a memoir by Michelle Zauner. As a 20-something writer, Zauner is fighting something of an uphill battle. Is she developed enough in her thinking to have anything worthwhile to say? And if she does, will people listen to her anyway? Well, there's not much she can do about the latter. As for the former, I'm chafing against these binary ideas even as I say them. Yes, I think there were some instances where Zauner could have thought more deeply, or used less overwrought language. But there were more instances where Zauner was deeply insightful about her unusual experiences. Zauner lost her mother to cancer when she was in her 20s, and the memoir chronicles caring for this woman in her final months. So it's about the fraught nature of caretaking with family and friends as a loved one is suffering. It's also broadly about mother-daughter relationships, and specifically about whether one can feel connected to one's culture after a parent dies. As someone from a mixed family herself, that spoke to me quite deeply. I also think that Zauner did a fantastic job utilizing food as a means of creating both character and memory. Some parts of the book felt uneven, particularly the lack of development for Zauner's husband. But when it came to the crux of what she wanted to say here, which was chronicling her mother's life and death and how they defined her own, she was totally on point. And one positive of her youth is that I hope she continues to write and share her evolving wisdom as time goes by. In number 2, I put Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese-American heroes in World War II by Daniel James Brown. In contrast to the book I put in 6th place, this is history that really spoke to me. It comes down to the fact that while the narrative is about big world events, it's also chronicling the experiences of 5 individuals with emotional lives. And Brown's form of writing existed somewhere between nonfiction reportage and historical fiction writing. Granted, the subject matter is also very juicy, and I would say very challenging. It's about the 442nd Infantry Regiment of World War II, one of the most decorated ones, and one it seems that suffered a lot of casualties in the European war theater. It was also an exclusively Japanese-American unit. These Nisei, or American citizens of Japanese descent, fought for their country while their families were either being held in concentration camps or being denied citizenship if they were born overseas. As history readers, we're required to grapple with the fact that America purported to fight fascism abroad, while the government stripped citizens of their rights without due process, and society engaged in institutional racism without question. Very few people fought back against this oppression, though one was Gordon Hirabayashi, the only non-soldier Brown chronicled. Though in fairness, Brown name-dropped a lot of people, whether in battle or in other situations around the war, so some details could be lost. I also think he occasionally strayed too far into the melodrama, and sometimes I chafe, too, against the valor of war, this closed loop of violence and self-righteousness, even when it's imperative to fight. But overall, this book was both academically informative and also a visceral reminder of the trials, tribulations, joys, and dreams of these real and oft overlooked Japanese Americans. And finally, in the #1 spot, I put A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life by George Saunders. This is probably the most subversive pick for top nonfiction ever. I mean, how much more team fiction can you get? This whole book is a homage to how short stories pave the way to the meaning of life. I think this book is also controversial because it challenges the veracity of nonfiction. It's very much a book about translation, interpretation, and sometimes a lack of knowledge. Here's a question. Can we truly know a short story or any piece of literature without A, being completely fluent in the writer's language, or B, without knowing absolutely everything about the writer's biography? Would even that be enough? Can we truly know what a writer meant to say without some sci-fi device which would give us access to all of their thoughts? Am I going off the rails here? Probably. I'm getting defensive. Because, like George Saunders, I want to keep reading literature, even when it's in translation. And even when I don't know everything, or anything, about the writer's inspirations. Arguably, there's a point where art has to stand on its own, where there has to be enough of a universal message for anyone to grasp. But I would also argue, and Saunders does too, that there aren't as many absolutes when it comes to literature. There isn't just one interpretation. I was concerned at first because Saunders is an MFA professor in a really prestigious program and a bit of a snob. I don't always agree with what he emphasized or left out of his essays. But he wrote about complexity when probing characters and situations. And he challenged me. And then he ended with, well, anyway, that was all according to George. Confidence and humility in literary criticism. As a writer and as a reader, I love this. So, that about covers it for me now. For more, you can read my Goodreads reviews of these 6 books now that I'm officially allowed to post them. They are linked down below. Again, I would love to hear your thoughts about this ballot or any of the ballots of the BookTube Prize or any reading at all. Why not? I just came off of a high talking about the love of literature. The semifinals are going on until the end of July, but I am actually taking a bit of a break from the BookTube Prize and getting some other reading goals out of the way, I hope, and I am looking forward to likely coming back in to judge the finals. But I think for my next video, I'm gonna chill things out a bit, not have to worry so much about all the reviews and the scripting and the yada yada, and I'm just gonna do a quick author's answer video. So those are usually pretty short and sweet, so stay tuned for that in the coming days. And before I go, of course, I have to thank Robert so much for the incredible work he has done, wrangling over 300 judges from 45 countries, I believe it is, and making sure we all submitted our ballots on time, including those of us who really waited till the last minute. And thank you to all of my fellow judges for making this whole prize possible with me. I'm having a lot of fun expanding my reading and talking about all this stuff. I hope you are too. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. And I'll see you next time.